You may recall that back in the 80s, a chemical plant in Bhopal, India, had a massive release of a toxic gas that killed thousands of people and injured many others. That plant was owned by Union Carbide Corporation, an American firm at the time, which has since been absorbed by Dow Chemical. The accident in Bhopal got a lot of attention and sparked concerns here in the United States about what were the hazards, of industrial facilities in the midst of our own populations. And so Congress passed a law that requires facilities that meet certain reporting thresholds in terms of how many pounds of toxic chemicals they handle, how many people they employ, what industrial sector they're in. For firms that meet these reporting requirements, they have to submit to the EPA annual reports on the quantity of toxic chemicals that they've released into the air, land, and water. For about 600 different chemicals. For each chemical by chemical, they have to give quite detailed reporting on the quantities that are released. Those data, the TRI or Toxics Release Inventory data, became the basis for the news stories that you may have seen saying, here are the major polluters in the state of Michigan or Massachusetts or whatever, right? Those news reports just took the raw TRI data, which are reported in pounds of chemicals released. And what they would do is they would just, here are the 600 chemicals, here's the pounds of chemical 1, 2, and 3, add them all up and you get total pounds. In the 1990s, the EPA decided that they would try to build upon that TRI data in order to help prioritize enforcement actions by federal EPA and state environmental authorities. And to do so, they realized that the TRI data alone, though they were really important input, were not sufficient because they didn't tell you, number one, how toxic the different chemicals are. It turns out that among the chemicals that are reported, some of them are much more toxic than others. In fact, they vary by up to 7 orders of magnitude. That is to say, pound for pound, some of these things are 10 million times more toxic than others. So if you just add up the pounds, it's giving you a pretty crude approximation of what the problem is. So EPA went through a lot of effort to develop state-of-the-art toxicity weights, as they call them, to assign different weights to different chemicals depending upon their toxicity through both inhalation, breathing, or ingestion, eating or drinking through water pathways. That was the first piece of information they added. It went through a lot of peer reviews, a lot of debate, and they now have toxicity weights for the majority of the chemicals in the database. EPA then took a further step, which was to say we not only care about how much chemicals are released and how toxic they are, but also about how many people are affected by these. So to assess that, they used models that show how air pollution and water pollution are distributed in the environment. These are called fade and transport models. So they take into account, for example, in the case of air pollution, how tall is the smokestack, what's the exit gas velocity, what are the prevailing wind patterns, how fast does this stuff get deposited or break down in the environment, and in that way they mapped the resulting exposures across the landscape resulting from releases at each of the 20,000 plus facilities that report to TRI. Finally, they took that data and combined it with U.S. Census information showing population distributions in order to get numbers of how many people were being impacted. So the same releases, the same toxicity in a place in a densely populated area would be a bigger public health problem from the standpoint of number of resulting cases of cancer or other health impacts than a place that's more sparsely populated. We have used that data from the EPA to do two things, to kind of add two pieces on top of what EPA has already done. Piece number one is that what EPA does is it releases that information. It's actually available to the public. You can get it in a free CD-ROM from the EPA. It's called the Risk Screening Environmental Indicators Index, or RSEI. You can go to Google, you can get it, you can get the data, and you can look and you can see facility by facility, what are they releasing, how toxic is it, what's the score associated with it, the score being based on not only how much, but also how toxic, how the fate and transport, and the number of people impacted. That's facility by facility, right? Now, the first thing we did was we said, well, we can take that facility by facility data and figure out who owns which facilities and develop scores for corporations that are simply the sum of the scores for the facilities owned by corporations. Now, this may sound like a pretty easy thing to do. You just add up, this facility is owned by these people, this one by... It turns out it's not that easy. The data on ownership of these facilities is incomplete and riddled with various problems, including that sometimes the facilities reported as being owned by Corporation A, but Corporation A really belongs to Corporation B, which in turn belongs to Corporation C, and so you've got to trace through this ownership structure, and moreover, there are constantly mergers and acquisitions and facilities being sold and bought and so on. So we constantly have to try to monitor the structure of ownership of these facilities.